for a named operation or an emergency. So the President then authorizes the SecDef to federalize reserve forces. But like we talked about this morning, in a time of constant conflict in the gray zone, the President could delegate that authority to the SecDef for more regular use and employment of the reserve components. And then third, pre-planned mobilization support under Section 12304B. It's also a great option, but it's only for pre-planned mission support of combatant commanders. So the mission and the cost must be forecast and included in the service budget. So what we found is that adaptive and regular use of these mobilization authorities will ultimately improve reserve component readiness and response time when they're needed. Next, we looked at how the reserve component mobilizes. Typically, they go through MOB stations or MFGIs. But during large-scale mobilizations, these sites will be congested and time will be critical. So alternate mobilization options could expedite the process and reduce stress on the MFGIs. So the National Guard has used a process called home station mobilization, typically for homeland-based missions. And over the last couple of years, that's developed into what's called in-place mobilization and used for OCONUS deployments. And what we found to be most effective is a hybrid model, focusing on completing as much training as possible at home station to minimize the time spent at an MFGI. We also found that First Army is further developing this concept, and it's going to incorporate both the Army Reserve and the National Guard. And they're expecting to publish their updated tailored mobilization process in May this month. So that's all I've got. I'll be followed by Mike Barnett.
Good afternoon, Lieutenant Colonel Mike Barnett. I'm the active duty component of this trifecta, Models and Sims officer, and I'll be talking about the parts of the mobilization functions. So when we looked at during our research on the operations of the functional and regional mobilization sites that prepare and train forces across the competition continuum to support the commander in the theater of operations. We learned before, the theater could be the homeland, could be overseas. The functional mobilization force generation installation focuses training and mobilizing forces by their military occupation specialty or warfighting function with training equipment sets designed specifically to that particular occupation or function. Organizing the MFGIs by function also requires the alignment of the observer controller trainer support provided by First Army. Exceptions to a functional MFGI would include a regional or hybrid concept, as Mark just mentioned. A regional mobilization installation supports multiple occupations in a geographic area and requires additional training sets across the mobilization enterprise, along with increases in the observer controller trainer support provided by First Army. The functional concept supports the recommendation to divest the Deputy Commanding General for mobilization position while increasing the authorities and responsibilities of the Installation Directorate of Plans, Training, Mobilization, and Security. The DPTMS Director, currently collaborating with installation support elements and Army transportation capabilities, will then have greater command and control over the mobilization process. The DPTMS Director relationship with an expanded civilian workforce, which we'll discuss in a moment, will improve efficiencies across the mobilization enterprise. Next, we looked at the resource investment in MFGIs and other existing Army total force infrastructures to improve the mobilization enterprise. The Department of Defense should address support to large-scale combat operations as an investment in the mobilization force generation installations and other existing total Army force infrastructure. An assessment of facilities projected to support large-scale mobilization operations is required across all components. Efficient use of the facilities and installations is realized through improvements to storage facilities, container storage and management, permanent and portable ramp loading capabilities, and many other items addressed throughout our research. Improving the mobilization process should make it faster, safer, and less expensive due to the suggested phased implementation coordinated across the reserve component. Infrastructure improvements across the Army total force streamlines mobilization interoperability in times of peace and war, while reducing material handling and storage costs. Next, Colonel Ryan Noble is going to discuss modifications to the civilian workforce and improvements to container management. Colonel Noble.
Good afternoon. Next, we recommended expanding the civilian workforce and contracting functions for improved deployable readiness. The Army should alter the civilian workforce and contracted assistance for increased continuity and deployable readiness. Altering the civilian workforce includes expanding permanent hires and contracted surge plans at mobilization force generation installations, specifically at the Directorates of Plans, Training, Mobilization, and Security, and Logistics Readiness Centers to reallocate a reserve component brigadier general and over 1,300 soldiers across 20 units currently assigned to that mission per location. The current mobilization model relies too heavily on the reserve component to validate deploying units. These units and soldiers are better served training to perform their wartime mission for combatant commander in support of large-scale combat operations. Modifying a portion of the reserve component maintenance shop authorizations from dual-status military technicians to Department of the Army civilian positions will improve hiring efficiency and operational readiness. Approximately 90% of the shop staffing are dual-status military technicians, and there's approximately a 30% vacancy rate due to numerous competing requirements. The reserve component may lose experienced logisticians from the civilian force that do not meet requirements because they chose to retire after serving honorably for more than 20 years. Regardless, preventing qualified civilians from working at a storage and maintenance facility in the strategic support area is a concern. A change to the dual status military technician program will require congressional approval, as General Hokanson alluded to earlier today. So the reserve component should conduct a workforce study to analyze and present terms for change to the Department of the Army. The final strategic recommendation is to improve container management. The Army lacks container management capacity to support large-scale combat mobilization operations. Container management is the process of establishing and maintaining visibility and accountability of all cargo containers moving globally with the oversight of the Surface Deployment and Distribution Command as the global container manager. The Army and STDC performed well over the past 20 years to ensure units met their deployment timelines for cargo, but they should accomplish the following to properly support future large-scale mobilization operations. Number one, improve container inventory. 2, improve container management. And 3, increase proficiency of movement control team functions. The first area for improvement lies within increasing the inventory of the containers and reserve component. The reserve component possesses approximately 10% of the required containers to meet deployment needs of their authorized equipment. Government-owned containers in the reserve component must be increased at scale to provide the needed training and cost efficiency for large-scale mobilization operations. In the early days of the global war on terrorism, the DoD was unprepared to conduct global container management at scale, and it cost the taxpayer approximately $1 billion in late fees for unreturned and leased shipping containers. The second area for improving container management is contained in the Joint Container Management System and its relationship with the STDC. Increased serviceable containers at scale accounted for in the system will provide strategic asset visibility to meet future contingency operations. The current average of 10% of required serviceable containers in the reserve component does not allow for units to get enough repetitions certifying and loading containers to prepare for deployments. The third area for improvements to container management falls within the proper utilization of movement control teams. Movement control teams support container marshaling yards for receiving containers and coordinating transportation requirements for onward movement of containers to receiving units and supply support activities in theater. Command emphasis and increased availability of containers is needed to improve readiness. The movement control team should perform these tasks to standard during weekend duty and at various exercises to maintain their proficiencies. In conclusion, our integrated research project proposed addressing the 6 strategic needs of, number 1, maximizing the effective use of reserve component mobilization authorities and levels of mobilization. 2, leveraging alternate mobilization sites. 3, operating functional mobilization force generation installations. 4, expanding civilian hires and contracting for increased continuity and reallocation of deployable readiness. And 5, investing in mobilization force generation installations and other existing Army total force infrastructure. And finally, 6, improving container management to better meet large-scale mobilization operation requirements. These recommendations help enable the United States to win the fight to the fight by improving the nation's ability to mobilize and deploy forces rapidly to meet the combatant commander's mission requirements. We look forward to your questions.
Thank you. That's great. It touches on logistics, as we've heard before, is a challenge. We're talking about mobilization. We're talking about the compos and reserve component. And we will take questions after we get through the whole panel. So if you would think of them now, write them down, and you'll have a couple other things to consider before we go on. But we have some systems that were designed, some regulations that were designed, and perhaps all of that needs to be changed now that our operational environment has changed also. With that, we had the Marines talk to us a little bit about what their role is in the future, and joint forcible entry was one of those things that we used to talk about. And the Marines publicly now have this Joint Vision 2030, I believe it is, that they're looking for. One of the things they're saying that they don't do anymore at scale is this forcible entry. And there's been a lot written on that. I'm not going to get into the politics of it, but the whole idea is that joint forcible entry against a A2AD kind of opponent is something that we've got to consider, maybe something that the military is required to do. So with that, the easy button is to say, okay, who's the executive agent for amphibious operations? And the answer comes back very quickly, the Army. So joint forcible entry is one of the things that Jonathan's written about, and I'm going to turn it over to him.
Okay, thanks, Greg. Yeah, my name's Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Holm. I'm an active duty field artillery officer. We've been spending a lot of time the past couple of days talking about employing strategic land power, but before you employ strategic land power, you have to deploy it. And you have to do that without first mover advantage, over great distances, and along contested lines of communication. And that third component is a new and sort of unprecedented problem for us. Historically, we've been able to deploy along generally uncontested or lightly contested lines of communication to an intermediate staging base, amass combat power, set conditions, and then apply land power in support of the joint force. But I don't think that model necessarily holds against a peer threat with a robust anti-access area denial capability or A2AD capability. And therefore, we need to think of deployment with some of the same concepts that we consider for joint forcible entry operations. One of the challenges is, even if we apply that lens and we don't think of a deployment as a sort of administrative or logistical, still challenging, but an operation that takes place out of contact with the enemy, even if we think of it in terms of joint forcible entry operations, there's still multiple forms of interconnected and compounding risk to force, risk to mission, risk to timeline. Some of those include, we currently rely on whitetail and white hull, so commercially contracted aircraft and seacraft to transport 90% of our personnel and cargo day-to-day in competition. Those assets are unlikely to be available in crisis or conflict. So that puts all of that demand onto our not much less vulnerable strategic lift capabilities. The C-17 is not the most combat-ready asset to defend itself against the A2AD threat, and our seacraft even less so. That's compounded by the difficulties in setting conditions for joint forcible entry. Our joint doctrine tells us that we should seek to establish surprise, very challenging with the ubiquity of sensors on the modern battlefield, establish air control, sea control. We no longer have the largest Navy in the world. Our Navy is also globally dispersed. Our adversaries' navies are not. They have mass and interior lines, as General Flynn talked about yesterday, and also space control. That's in an environment where we do not anticipate being the first mover. We anticipate that someone like China, that might be the first domain where they seek to seize the initiative. Some examples of risk to mission, limited resources, already talked about for lift, but then also for enablers in multiple domains. Dr. Cantwell touched on the Marine Corps' changing mission with more of a focus on supporting the Navy from the land rather than large-scale amphibious operations and in support of a sustained ground campaign, and then the difficulty of once establishing a foothold or a beachhead or seizing that port of debarkation, achieving that tactical victory, but then translating that into an operational success of having a port of debarkation for follow-on forces and to establish as a sustainment node for follow-on operations. So I do have some recommendations. One of them is not to kind of wish away the problem. I think a lot of people look at how we have supported the Ukraine and are tempted to say, is this a model that is exportable to other crisis areas? I think it is not. I can go into more of that if you're interested in the question and answer. So what we need to focus on is understanding the problem more through additional modeling of what that attrition would look like. So conceptually, we can imagine that some of our lift assets and the embarked forces and capabilities on those lift assets could be attrited. This is not something that is currently modeled when we do our TIPFID conferences, because that's not the purpose. We have some exercises that look at or consider contested deployment, but a lot of our exercises are focused on what we do when we're already at the fight, and can sometimes hand wave what in-route attrition might look like, or the difficulty of establishing that foothold in the first place. Second component, we talked a little bit yesterday about setting the theater, but setting the theater for what? So if we anticipate we're going to have to deploy in a contested environment, we should set the theater in a manner that sets conditions for us to be able to deploy successfully in that environment, with the changes to our force posture, how we rotate certain enablers, the types of forces that we exercise in the contact layer, and maybe reevaluate our Army preposition stocks. And then finally, take a look at our capability gaps, including the survivability of our lift platforms, and as Dr. Cantwell alluded to, potentially taking a look at, does the Army need to reassume the mission of being able to conduct amphibious operations just to get into the fight. There is some good work that the Army is already doing in terms of the contested logistics cross-functional team that the Army Futures Command has just established, the Unified Pacific Wargaming Series and Operations Pathways that General Flynn touched on does account to some degree. It is a focus area to consider contested deployment and contested logistics, but more work needs to be done.
All right, that was great. I appreciate it. There's a lot of food on the table that I'm going to be ready for the buffet in a couple minutes here. But the idea is that, again, we talk about being contested in all domains. We had Bert's wonderful panel this morning and talked about, we may not have air superiority. The homeland's going to be at risk. We are so dependent upon cyber. We're so dependent upon space. And now the maritime also is going to be at risk there too. But we've got some National Guard folks that have actually been involved in our IRP, and they've got some great insight. One of them is actually a cyber expert, which is another rarity. But Jennifer has done a great job researching and looking at what the National Guard can do in the cyber field to help protect the homeland, which everyone is in favor of, and we're on the edge of our seats ready to have more information, ma'am.
Well, just to set the record straight, I'm in no way, shape, and form a cyber expert, so let's clear the air on that right now. I'm a lowly 25 series officer, not a 17 series, but good afternoon. My name is Lieutenant Colonel Jennifer Hunt, and I'm the Deputy G6 for the Florida Army National Guard, and it's a pleasure to be here today participating in this panel and also having the opportunity to participate in IRP, so thank you, Dr. Cantwell. Sure. My research really focused on the increasing threat of cyber attacks on U.S. national interests and specifically on critical infrastructure. I know, General Hoover, you've brought this up several times. It's a challenging problem. And I also looked to identify some vulnerability gaps that exist as it relates to our protection plan, as well as our ability to respond to these threats. State and non-state actors are increasingly using the cyber domain to launch attacks in the gray zone against U.S. interests. That's no secret. But in the past, these efforts have focused mainly on Department of Defense organizations and other federal agencies. But recently, actors are progressively targeting entities outside of the DoD, including state, tribal, territorial governments, critical infrastructure, and private companies. So while existing national guidance, strategies, and response plans, as well as the creation of Cybercom, have improved the nation's ability to respond to these threats, there remains a gap in protection at the state and local level, specifically as it relates to critical services and infrastructure. My paper really assessed why I think the National Guard is uniquely positioned to fill the cyber capability gaps and the Homeland's defense, and to serve as the lead support agency in all state and local cyber attacks. My study assessed the current domestic cyber threat, the history and capabilities of the DoD cyber forces, national cyber response efforts as they stand today, the National Guard as a force enabler, and then really the .mil PF changes that would need to take place in order to leverage the National Guard in this particular arena. Some of the key findings included, which is no secret, that cyber attacks against state and local government critical infrastructure is definitely on the rise. These attacks can disrupt or shut down essential services, such as power grids, water treatment plants, transportation. And in 2022, there were over 2,300 cyber attacks that were reported to the FBI, and over 36% of those attacks were against critical infrastructure. Also in 2022, the Microsoft Digital Defense Report claims that cyber attacks targeting critical infrastructure worldwide jumped from 20% of all nation-state attacks to over 40%. The current cyber mission force teams lack the manning and flexible authorities necessary to support forward offensive and defensive cyber operations while simultaneously defending the strategic homeland interest and supporting state and local governments across all 54 states and territories. The mission requirements that they have as is are enormous in scope and size. And this is especially true in large-scale combat operations where we expect the homeland to be contested and where we may even be looked at supporting or defending multiple fronts. I can guarantee you that if cyber attacks occur across multiple states and territories while we're trying to project a force forward for large-scale combat operations, that there will be problems and degradation in our efforts, especially as we talk about moving from the fort to port. Some of the other findings included that the national cyber frameworks and response plans, such as the National Cyber Incident Response Plan, and they're all federally centric approached, and they do not integrate or consider state and governors' authorities. They gloss over the capabilities and the roles and responsibilities of the DoD as well as the National Guard cyber forces. Some of the National Guard specific findings included that National Guard cyber mission force that differs across all 54 states and territories, with some possessing cyber protection teams, some possessing defense cyber operation elements, and some possessing both. The DCOEs, or the Defense Cyber Operation Elements, are TDA elements that are not currently aligned to the federal cyber mission, so therefore they can't be used as a force augmenting. Other states have built their own completely different cyber capabilities in an ad hoc situation. The level of training and expertise differ across all 54 states and territories, but I would argue that the National Guard's proximity and relationships with state and local government agencies and the critical infrastructure sector, the familiarity and the integration with FEMA and the National Risk Response Framework, and flexibility in both manning and authorizations make it the ideal first responder to state and local cyber attacks. The National Guard can mobilize and operate in 3 distinct legal statuses: state active duty, Title 32, and Title 10. And the National Guard is located with state and local governments and maintains an existing community relationship that's already in play. The National Guard can build scalable response teams capable of responding to an explicit threat and can do so using multiple authorizations. So essentially my recommendation, which is not always popular, is that we need to look at allocating the force structure necessary to provide the National Guard in all 54 states and territories with some form of a full-time either joint cyber CST or civil support team, or an Army cyber CPT that is aligned with our cyber federal mission. This provides the state and local critical infrastructure protection that we need, and also if it's standardized across all states, it provides a force multiplier to our cyber. You know, partnering with the National Guard to divest and reorganize the existing DCOE manning and to move it into either a CST, cyber CST, or a CPT, it also kind of helps to eliminate some of the resources that it's going to be taxing. Furthermore, you know, I think that we need to look at revising the joint doctrine to capitalize on the National Guard authorities' flexibility and the way we're utilizing Title 32, 501F specifically for training. It needs to be reviewed and modified to allow for greater response efforts. So until then, until we make some of these changes, which would be difficult decisions, I know, given the current resource environment, I truly believe that the U.S. Homeland, state, and local critical infrastructure remains vulnerable to cyber attacks.
Well, thank you for that. Good news, right? No. So we talked about a fight to the fight. We talked mobilization. We've got all the compos, and we've got to get folks that are out there doing their day job, and we've got to get them somehow or another mobilized. And we're going to have cyber that's messing with everything that we have that we're supposed to use to try to do this effectively. Once we do that, no problem. We'll go ahead and we'll have joint forcible entry against an adversary that doesn't want us to be there. But I think with that, we'll have plenty of room for questions. Oh, and I forgot, we want to get rid of one general too. So that's another recommendation, and more containers. So what are your questions for the group? Oh, come on.
Greg, I don't know.
Please.
I'm not sure I have a question yet. I'll think about that. But I do want to say congratulations to all of you. You know, you guys gave me a briefing on your papers, you know, just a couple months back or so. And so it's great to see how it's all kind of come together. And you know, the 3 of you over here have each of you have a project into itself. And, maybe for next year, we ought to think about just somebody writing on container management because, as the commander of the Joint Sustainment Command in Afghanistan, container management and, trying to inventory the containers that was in there and avoiding, the $1 billion number you said, I think is actually low. That's an annual number.
Today's dollars, it would be.
Yeah, the amount we paid in detention fees, and that goes to how Transcom negotiated those contracts with the seagoing carriers that own the containers that's a whole nother story. But that's a paper unto itself. The personnel piece is a paper unto itself. And then the whole mobilization process and the stations and why do we do some of the stupid things that we're doing for just homeland mobilization? I mean, that's a whole nother paper. So I just want to say congratulations, really, job well done from, what the briefings that you gave me a couple months ago.
They did a great job condensing all of this information too, and I want you to know that Tim had nothing to do with it. So, pop it up, guys. Questions, please. Yes, over there.
So again, Colonel Clay from Army Europe. So the question is, based on the hypothetical possibility of Battle of the Atlantic Part 3, World War I, World War II, and in the future, talking about the contested logistics. And this is framed by a discussion that I was part of several years ago where the question was raised by a Coast Guard officer when we were talking about mobilization, port to port, things like APS afloat and so forth is, what is the plan and what is the Army's conversation? Because the Coast Guard will protect those ships for 12 nautical miles off U.S. coast. Whose responsibility is to protect it once it gets beyond that point to the port of need in the other theater? And what are we doing to talk to the Navy, the Air Force, and also additionally, again, Battle of the Atlantic, our allies and partners to mitigate some of those risks of being able to mobilize from port to port and then port to war?
I don't know if you guys researched that, but I do see a Marine sitting out there from Naval War College that I'd be happy to put that question to.
No, we're more CONUS based to really just to get the reserve component through, validated by First Army, and on a plane, and all the equipment from the various storage and maintenance locations to the port to leave CONUS. So that's a little outside our area.
And I know Colonel Olson's had some experience here, but I don't know if he can share it with us in this form.
No, step right up.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Cantwell. Yeah, so so I'm Matt Olson from the Mission Command Seated, run the Echelons Above Brigade Limited Objective Experiment Series. So we have looked at somewhat at contested deployments briefly in our last experiment. So to really answer your question, yeah, it really gets at the joint forcible entry proposition, or your paper. We really can't assume that we're going to have sea control or air control. In fact, what we see in our experiments is the exact opposite. So when you look at certain theaters and you look operating inside those threat rings, that intra-theater lock, the ability to secure that, that's a huge challenge for us working forward. So.
Yes, sir. And just to kind of add on to that, so I didn't look specifically at how the sea services see themselves kind of deconflicting and who owns what. But based on the posture statements from the CNO and Transcom commander and from Secretary of the Air Force, their mentions of anything strategic lift is almost like a passing thought. It's not something that I think the services that we rely upon to get Landpower into the fight, it is not their priority. They seem to be very focused on, the Air Force modernizing their pointy nose, joint fires capable, strategic bombing, ISR capabilities, and likewise with the Navy, getting strategic land power into the fight, and the requirement to provide, strategic lift is not a priority from the service perspective. And even the Transcom commander's focus, when she talked about strategic lift, it was her concern was much more about readiness just being able to generate sufficient, cargo space in the sea lift fleet, and especially the airlift fleet, more so than the survivability or thinking of her command's responsibility as almost being a warfighting command, not just a kind of UPS with an American flag on the back. So I don't get the sense that the overall deployment enterprise really sees their mission as having fundamentally changed from kind of being a FedEx for the United States government to being kind of an organization that's going to have to fight through to the point of delivery.
Go ahead, sir.
You know, when you think of the Indo-Pacific fight, that General Flynn was talking about yesterday, and the geography, and we think of trying to deploy forces forward into that theater, whether it's on the peninsula or wherever it is in that theater, those long lines of communication complicate it. But what further complicates it, and he didn't raise it yesterday, and I think you did a little bit yesterday, the NEO piece. So it's all the people we're trying to get out with strategic lift, at the same time trying to push people in, and that's a challenge right there, and a gap that I think we haven't really wrestled to ground yet, because the NEO piece is, just think of the peninsula, getting people off of the peninsula while we're trying to get into the peninsula over that long of a line of communication and, great geography distance, that's a whole nother paper right there.
I would just, go ahead, Professor, I'll come back after you.
No, go ahead, sir. We got two more questions, but if you had a comment, sir, we'll take it.
It's just that, having sat and watched this mess for the last 40 years in terms of, what our forcible entry capabilities, we used to call it amphibious warfare, amphibious assault, that's too ugly. So we'll dress it up and we'll call it JIFIO. It sounds neat, it sounds clean, it sounds surgical. But this idea that we are always going to start, and I think you mentioned that, Jonathan, we are always going to have this mature, developed infrastructure, forward staging base, intermediate staging base, without having to, in fact, create that lodgement for assault follow-on echelons. I mean, that's the whole point of forcible entry, going someplace where you don't have a permission slip. So we either cede that capability as a nation. We say, we're not going to do it. And oh, by the way, I don't think the Marine Corps has come off forcible entry. We've certainly identified in response to National Defense Strategy, focus on pacing threat, PRC, naval integration, but that hasn't, getting out of the business of forcible entry, to the best of my knowledge, has not been part of that discussion. It's not a World War II model. It's probably something more like the Falklands. How would we do what the British did in 1982? That's probably a model, but either we say we're going to geo-prepo everything we need and we are going to fly someplace, marry up with gear strategically located around the globe, and that's how we'll fight, or we have to start thinking more seriously about how we get there. The fight to get to the fight. Amphibious doctrine has always talked about the need for pre-assault operations, supporting operations to create the conditions, and they are about local air superiority, maritime. You have to establish that it's a prerequisite. You can't do it without it. But it's a hard nut to crack, and unfortunately, it's so hard we ignore it. And that's why we've seen this capability that correctly identifies what a superpower is. It's just atrophied over the last 20, 30, 40 years. We've talked about the L-class shipping. 1970s, we had almost 80 L-class ships designed to do that sort. We're down now into the 20s of available for tasking. So it's either this country decides that we're going to build these pre-post sites around the globe, fly the forces there, fall in the gear, go fight the fight, or we're going to find a way to get it from here to there. I'm not suggesting it's easy, but because it's so difficult, we've chosen to ignore it for decades. And now we're in this jam where 90% of what went to Desert Storm went over the sea lanes. It didn't fly in there. It went by black bottom, gray bottom shipping. So,
Is there, one of the models I was given was to talk about, and Colonel Olson's living this, that's what he does for a living with concepts, turning them into capabilities, so to speak. But the idea was that in Europe, we had to try to figure out how would we fight the fight. So take the amount of resources we anticipated would be on the continent, and from there, how do we fight the fight, and then come up with this thing called air-land battle doctrine, and then build the Army to be able to do what we thought that fight would be on the ground, to fight outnumbered and win, and strategic kind of defense kind of thing where you'd fall back. Some thought is that, well, we'll do the same thing in the Pacific and we'll backwards build the force structure to support that. I don't know if that model's still any good. I don't know if that's, if you can assume that because it worked with large, with established landlocks and allies, that you can apply that same model over in the Pacific or not. But there's a lot of good work with that, and I know Matt's ready to jump on it.
Try not to be too specific here. But yeah, I mean, when we look at the Indo-Pacific, the obvious answer is you can't. And then, sir, your point about those extended locks, that's what we would see is you can pre-position stuff forward, but then when those threat rings go hot, Transcom is only going to deliver to the forward edge of those threat rings. So now when we talk about intra-theater lines of communication and the assets that you would need to flow forces in, you start looking at the status of Army watercraft, and you look at extended distances in the Pacific, and then you look at the extent to which, I'm looking at red over there, they're going to target you.
Thanks for talking
And the
about
attrition that goes through the platforms, your ability to force flow is going to be highly impacted. So the types of forces that you can bring into a scenario like that, it's completely different. So so part of it is you just have to think differently in terms of what your force posture would need to be, what the role of the Army is, what it's contributing to the joint force. But the idea of what we're going to do, like you said, Dr. Cantwell, because we've looked at it, just to kind of test our force structure, take our standing force, our standard designs from divisions, see how they may operate. The ability, we've demonstrated that we're highly challenged in force flowing any type of capability of that size and scale. It is really that the contested intra-theater lock is really, really hard to manage. And then the air piece, how do you suppress IADs over extended distances, do any type of aerial insertion or flowing in C-17? So it's a huge challenge. So the answer is no. We're not applying the same model. What we've been doing is kind of testing, how our force structure might actually operate under those high-grade threat conditions that would be imposed upon us.
Sure, not trying to imply that's exactly what you're doing, saying that's a model that's been proposed, that's all. And thank you for clarifying that.
And just on red real quick, those range rings,
Yeah.
you're talking, if you think about the second island chain, right? That's what you're talking about, what you need to pierce, and that's gonna continue to grow.
We concur.
But what we don't think about is when you flip it the other way, right? Launching from the western part of that country, you range the Mediterranean. We don't think about that in terms of flowing sustainment. So
Yeah, we have not solved that problem, and I appreciate you making it more difficult for us. But, no, that's what you're paid for, so I appreciate that. We do have some questions, so I'm going to take one over here, and then you, Bert.
Hi, Joe Cressito, Space Missile Defense Command, Strategic Analyst. I'll make a comment because everybody talked about everything on my first question. I was just going to say, sounds like we're talking about fighting multi-domain from fort to port. It may be a little more kinetic the closer we get to theater, but you're still fighting in multi-domain. I think with the fact that the expanse and the reach of multi-domain capabilities is global, not all of them, but within the multi-domain construct, your reach is global. We're going to be fighting from fort all the way to port, and how do we tackle that? And it's a multi-domain fight all the way across, no matter which way we're going, east or west or north. The other question was regarding the cyber protection teams and the cyber capability in the Guard. How would you do that in a 24-hour coverage kind of thing? Because it's not something you can do like part-time, so if you could just address that.
Well, yes, sir. So my argument is that we need to have a Title 32 AGR joint CST or AGR CPT versus the traditional end-day soldier. for that exact reason. But not just that, but so much about protecting against cyber attacks has to do with the defense side and building those partners and that relationship with some of the critical infrastructure in the state well in advance of a cyber attack ever occurring, and understanding what their baseline network looks like, so we can then understand what the anomaly is on it, and that trust is created in advance. And so that's, I think that it's wonderful to have MDA or traditional soldier cyber elements, as long as they're standardized across all the states. However, I think the real money is by developing a small full-time force structure that manages that all the time.
And the Air Guard does that. They already have some Air Guard cyber teams, right, that are on tour.
They do, but they're not specific to every state. Again, it's not standardized, so it's very, and they have more full-timers, 30% versus 16.
Do you get the sense that that's a trade-off they'd be willing to make in kinetic force structure to go to a non-kinetic? You getting any sense of that from what you saw in your research?
I'm counting on General Vile to fight for that in the future.
Yes.
But I don't know that we're there yet. I think a few more colonial pipelines and a few more water treatment plant issues, then we will be there. I don't think we're quite there yet.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
That's great. You see, I told you she was a cyber expert. Bert?
Just to follow up on that, and Jennifer, you've forgotten more about this than I know, but just for everyone's information, in addition to what they were talking about in some of the states, there are now non-guard cyber teams in all of the FEMA regions right now. So another good opportunity, I would suggest, for the states and for the Guard within the states is to team with those established entities that are already in there and expand a little bit upon the mission to provide for the additional protection. And what they're starting to, I forget how they say it, but ever so gingerly, talking about an almost offensive capability against someone who is doing something immediately within that region. Kind of interesting, kind of a delicate dance. But that's not my question.
So Bert, what's your question?
I did want to thank the gentleman because I thought, Balboni is alive and well, and he's hiding in another body right now, because he started talking about contested deployment beginning within the territorial confines of the United States, which I know all of you are thinking about. But the question I've got for you right now is, have we approached to the point where we recognize the limitations that we have as the military component of our security within the United States, and the requirements that we're going to have from other entities, other agencies, other functions in getting us from port to port?
So if I can just speak to this on the
Please do.
cyber side, and then I'll turn it over to the rest of the panel. Yes, and again, I think that's why it's so important to have this small full-time force, either with regards to the Joint Cyber CST or the Army CPTs, because they can then begin to work with the state, local, county, municipalities, and train them, and really work on expanding their capabilities so that they are in a better state to respond from a civil perspective versus the military if necessary. So training is a huge aspect of why, again, I'm arguing for kind of that small element of full-time support.
Right. And once again, as Jennifer knows far better than I do, the Guard has assumed one of its traditional roles in vulnerability assessments, but from a cyber perspective. And there are wildly different capabilities spread throughout the United States with regard to that issue, but it's something else that the Guard is taking on. Kind of interesting. Now, answer my question, guys.
All right, gentlemen.
Well, I don't know how well it relates to it. So one of the main things that we were proposing was instead of mobilizing I said on average, because every MFGI has a different amount of soldiers assigned to it. So it was an average of 1,300 soldiers, 20 units per, and instead of bringing all that deployable readiness that could be better utilized for a combatant commander in theater, if you just beef up the DPTMS has a general schedule 14, director civilian, has a robust organization. If you build that up, and then same thing with the LRC, you can get rid of those Combo 2 and 3 packages, and if you don't have to bring all those soldiers and all that equipment to the MFGI to begin with, then that's eliminating threat right there. So it doesn't have to travel, and then of course it eliminates costs and whatnot, and also then it makes those soldiers available to the actual large-scale combat operation. So I don't know if that answers that.
That's a good start, and that's one of the areas, but once again, that's something that we very specifically control within the Green Team. The thing I'm talking about, for instance, is that movement that we've taken for granted forever in the 20th century, from Bragg to Savannah where we're just casually going to get on board the ships, and there's not going to be any problem getting off post. There's not going to be any problem going through those lines of communication, which we don't own. There's not going to be any problem with regard to directing traffic or things like that, which, oh, by the way, is beyond the purview of the active component of the United States military. Who's going to do that kind of stuff, and what are we doing right now to prepare with those guys, whoever they are?
So during our research, sir, we found that the current staffs of the MFGIs were looking at those problems as it related to cyber protection, protecting the electrical grid, infrastructure, getting to the railhead, getting from the railhead to the port. So they're working those contingency considerations into their plans, not only on paper, but they're exercising it. When we discussed this at length with the folks at Fort Stewart, Fort Bliss, and they were looking at how the current, even like the Mobilization Exord, which was written almost 8 years ago, is currently out of date, but it is, fortunately, it is in revision, so that the Army is looking at these things to they're aware of these concerns, especially with the effects of cyber, and all those threats that are right outside the door, right off post, that are going to impact that. Even something as, you think about the civilian workforce, and this is why we address the civilian workforce in our research. If you affect the civilian workforce in such a way that they can't come to work, now what are you going to do? So that's another big concern that we start looking at. So those are things that those MFGIs, those personnel there, that are starting to look at that and make those changes to the doctrine, make recommendations to changes in doctrine, changes in orders, and the changes to their SOPs.
Sounds great, and you guys are going down a path that a friend of mine who was Northcom liaison to DHS for forever, Neil Anderson, he coined a term now that we're going to have to deal with called civil support to military activities. We haven't thought that way before, but in our society, with our idea, especially about the division between law enforcement and defense, that's something I suggest we're probably going to have to take on. And I'm glad to hear you going in that direction. Thank you.
They did, I had an opportunity to read their paper several times. But with that, one of the things that struck me was they talked about this hybrid concept, I guess, and they know more about this MGFI and large-scale mobilization operations. But they did talk about how does the active duty do it, and maybe they can learn some of that from the Guard and Reserve. So please.
In some respects, that was where, in the discussions with the First Army folks, they were going to look at how their certification programs can be applied a little bit closer to the training and allow some of these units to self-certify. Currently, Special Operations Forces do that at Fort Bragg. Their mobilization process, while it's conducted on that installation, is completely separate than the remainder of the active, or the remainder of the Army forces that mobilize through Fort Bragg. They've been certified by Big Army. They can do their own thing for the Special Operations community, and that gets into part of that self-certifying capability.
And the caveat to that is you could only do that for like certain specialized units, like a lot of the larger units, and they would still have to be validated by First Army at an MFGI. As part of our IRP, we did consider a RAND study. They took a reserve component units through a contingency TIFID and just ran the numbers and said, what are ways that we can improve the speed to get the soldiers to the combatant commander quicker. And they had 3 recommendations: was mobilize sooner, which is, it's got a lot of issues with that. I mean, funding and civilian, employment and all sorts of things that are unique to the reserve component. Then sequencing units. They said, send the easier units, smaller units through first. I said, well, great. The combatant commander doesn't need a whole bunch of 21 packs MCTs. He needs standard brigades and, BCTs and whatnot. So that wasn't too serious, but you still could get a little bit of benefit by being smart with how you sequence. But the number one thing they did recommend was invest in readiness left of the conflict. And that's where we zeroed in on. How do we make these units better? They're more apt to be able to be certified on their METs way left of the boom. And that's what every commander wants. That is, and we want units that know how to do their mission essential tasks. And one other thing they did mention was the bandwidth of the MFGIs is sufficient. We don't have to make them any bigger. They said it wouldn't really help. They ran the numbers, just making them just bigger and just doubling the amount of people that are running them. So the current XORD has enough primary active and active contingency locations for us to, to meet the requirements, but it's how can we make the reserve component like ready left of the conflict so they can get through and be validated by First Army in, let's say, 10 days instead of a month or plus. And I think it's key, like, the reason we got together for the Integrated Research Project is because we have unique capabilities being, Mike was active duty, or was National Guard, then active duty. Mark's a guardsman. I was active duty, and then I became a reservist. And then I was also a dual status military technician, civilian, and then now I'm a Department of the Army civilian. And Mark is also a dual status Title 32. So we've seen it from all different angles. I've actually, been a G3 MOB officer mobbing units through this process, seeing it on the other end in theater and whatnot. And then I've also, I've gone through it myself and gone through the pain myself at the different MFGIs. So we saw it at a whole bunch of different angles. And then, so when we started making a lot of these recommendations, there's the amount of money and time expended, you get a lot of juice from the squeeze for some of these. They're not maybe the most, technological, cyber, long-range fires and all that kind of stuff. But if we do these certain kind of things and we just make these reserve component units more ready left of the conflict, then we can just get them through faster. So it's not going to be front page news, but it's definitely going to help the combatant commander at the end.
Yeah, I was going to say, is this an Army-only problem? I mean, getting, fort to port and then port to theater in a contested environment. I mean, the other services, Air Force got their own lift or whatever, but it seems to me the other services are struggling with the same questions that you all have been presenting. And so, have we thought about, like, what is the joint solution to protecting the homeland in getting, fort to port, and then the joint solution of getting into the, getting our stuff to the contested theater, right? I don't know, just it struck me that this isn't an Army-only problem set. I don't know.
So I can talk that too, actually. But
Yeah. Can he respond, and then it's all your?
Sir, I agree that it's not, it will be a problem for the joint force, but the other services, I think they just don't quite see it that way, because the Navy has its primary mission, it sees is in the fight, and they're there, and they have mobility. The Air Force has mobility. When I worked at PACOM at a commander's conference, a few years ago, senior leaders from both services were talking about their first step would be to move east, not west, to get out of the threat, and then try to fight their way back in. And each seemed at the time to have a very service-centric approach. So I think the other services are putting less emphasis on it because the service culture of the Navy is they can win with sea power. The service culture of the Air Force is that they can win with air power. The service culture of the Army is it takes a joint force. So I think it's an Army problem because the Army is in the United States. The Air Force and the Navy they're already forward, and they have mobility that we do not have.
Yep.
And the Air Force sees itself as using what it perceives to be its list assets to move its repair parts, to move its spare engines, its munitions. So I'm not convinced that the joint force writ large is tackling this because there are these different service dynamics.
Good question, though, sir. Ian, you
no,
have
that's
some
fine. You
insight?
did a great job. I mean, that's exactly the answer. The problem is none of the joint forces have truly come to terms with RED's capabilities at the scale and scope that they exist today and where they're going to be in only 5 or 6 years. And so our ability to move within those weapons engagement zones it's very challenging, and that's a joint problem. So,
But I think it's one, if I could just continue on that, I think it's one that the Army can help with.
agree 100%.
Yeah, I mean, the Air Force relies on us to provide protection for their air bases, and, recent war games looked at a Taiwan scenario. 90% of the Air Force's fighter airplanes were destroyed on the tarmac. They were destroyed at a fixed air base. The Air Force can't defend against that threat. The Army potentially can, or can at least buy down some risk. We're not in the risk elimination, we're in the risk mitigation business with protection assets and with surface-based ground fires.
Yeah, I think with being unclassified and we're making stuff up, so to speak, in a hypothetical, well, it's a challenge we've got to address, and we've got to look at it as a joint problem rather than just a service. One capability is going to solve all things. So I'll turn it over to Mr. Threat himself. Ian?
Hey, first I wanted to thank you all for this panel, because every issue that you talked about really come front and center in everything that we're working. So not just Unified Pacific. We've run 3 separate Homeland war games, one for the Secretary and a couple with our North. In fact, we just recently finished one, and every one of these issues that you've talked about have played in all of them. So thank you for doing it. So the problem that I have as I look at this, and again, it comes down to Red, particularly in the Indo-Pacific, is they've really taken away our ability to effectively warn. They've moved rapidly, particularly over the last year or so, in order to move forces into combat positions today. And there's a lot that they can do right now if they choose to. And so, we used to think of warning in terms of 60, 90 days. If we're lucky, it's 90 minutes maybe, I don't know. But this creates real problems for the mobilization, and particularly the mobilization of the critical elements in Compo 2 or 3. So I'm curious, as you did your work and you came up with some interesting recommendations, did you think about Red at all as you came up with mobilization? And did you ask yourself the question, is this system good enough, or do we literally have to start from scratch? I liked some of your thoughts, particularly getting ready left of conflict, right? That's critically important. But we do like to say Red has a vote, and they have a really big one here. And the reality is C-Day may actually come well after D-Day for Red at this point. So that's problematic, and that's very problematic for mobilization. So I was just curious how and if Red factored into the thinking on mobilization, and if it didn't, would you think about doing it again and considering Red? Or I'll leave it at that.
We did think about that, but that would have been a whole other chapter.
Can you tell us your C-Day and your D-Day? Just clarify for everybody what your C-Day is and your D-Day is.
So when I say D-Day, I mean Red's D-Day, right? I don't mean Blue's D-Day. I mean Red, and it was a question that I asked to General Flynn yesterday, and I've talked to him at length about, this notion that the enemy gets to pick the time. They get to pick D-Day, they get to pick H-hour. So for us, as C-Day is essentially the day we get the authorities to do everything, to start mobilizing, right? To start rolling the tip fid. We like to think it becomes before Red's D-Day. If indications and warning works really well, it does. But, the way the enemy has postured themselves today, those times become much closer. And it's also, C-Day is also a political decision. It's a decision by the National Command Authority to say, okay, yeah, do it. And again, there's no guarantee that those days are lined up or they roll the way we need them to. They likely roll the way that is least convenient for us. And so that's an important point to consider. So that's why I brought that up. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Gentlemen, ladies.
One last comment.
Oh, I don't know if you heard that.
Switch it around.
Yeah, he said if logistics were easy, they would call it tactics. Okay. Thank you. Go ahead.
So I would say that some of the struggles that we face in Compo 2 and 3, and I'll speak specifically to Compo 2 because that's where I'm from,
Can you move the mic in closer?
really exist regardless of red. And a big part of that is equipment readiness. I'm sure Colonel Davis can speak to this as well from the ADA, but we oftentimes find ourselves, several generations behind the active component. It's difficult to get parts sometimes, and that money doesn't start to flow until you're about 12 months inside the deployment period. So I would say if we could solve the issue with equipment maintenance and readiness and parts, that we would be in a much better position to mobilize faster. I don't think it's necessarily the people, I think it's the equipment, and I would defer to my partners here.
That's what we got after, but that's like more in the weeds of the paper. But basically, the readiness divisions for the Army Reserve, there's 4 two-star readiness divisions, and they basically take care of all the storage and maintenance for just the U.S. Army Reserve. And they do an effects coordination board annually, and they had just done one about a month prior to us finishing our paper. And basically, they said if you we have the issue with the dual status military technicians not being able to fill it, so we have a 30% or more vacancy. So you don't have, for various reasons, you don't have all the mechanics there. Even if you snapped your fingers and gave them 100%, then they would need like another $70 million to get more parts and hire more people just to take care of the equipment in the Army Reserve. And I'm not even talking about Compo 2. And so pretty much right now, like the Army Reserve can only handle mobilizing units and specialized units like C2CRE, command and control, CBRN, response elements, and things like that. Like so that's that's what the MFGI plan. Like I said, it's great, but it's to handle small contingencies. It's a good plan, and then I'm sure we're all about being fiscally responsible and saving money. So we're using Compo 2 and 3 to run them. But when we think about the big fight, we can beef up the DPTMS and LRCs and not use the reserve forces, and then we can make infrastructure investments, personnel investments into the thousands of storage and maintenance facilities between Compo 2 and 3, and then if we can start hiring Department of Army civilians, they don't have to be dual status, because basically it's you're Monday through Friday you're working in a shop, and a DSMT is also a soldier doing drill or battle assembly for the Guard and the Reserve respectively. So if we can get after all that, and then we can increase our ability, we can be the readiness divisions said that you give us some more money, and we can hire at a higher level. We can start fixing all the equipment, and then it'll be ready, because right now when you're mobile, even if you're just mobilizing rotational units and these special units to do these shorter contingency operations, you're still doing a lot of cross leveling and just trying to make it work. And then the Army's always going to get it done. Leaders are not going to fail; they're going to get it done. But you'd reach a point really quick into a LISCO operation where that robbing Peter to pay Paul, so to speak, just wouldn't work anymore. So all these strategic investments over time gives us the manpower and the facilities to get that stuff to the power projection platform.
Is the parts issue because they haven't ordered them, or they're just supply chain issues that they've already been paid for, they just haven't been delivered?
The supply chain is fine. They just they won't have enough people to install them onto the vehicles. Or you have limitations, older facilities, to where the facilities were made for like CUCVs and things way back in the day, and they're still, the new vehicles don't even fit. They don't have overhead, cranes, just all sorts of things. But it's not a supply chain issue. It's a personnel issue.
All right, well, we've got time, I think, for one more question. I think.
If I don't mind, I just want to argue that one point real quick. So it depends on what you're talking about. So I came from an ESB, an Expeditionary Signal Battalion. And for us, I was Inc. 1B. And that equipment was so old that they no longer had it in stock. They actually had to create some of the parts that we needed, at Toby Hanna. So in some cases, it is a supply issue. It just depends on what equipment you're referencing and how old it is, what the legacy of the system is.
Okay, so generalizations, they're true and not true. We've got an expert from the LeMay Center in the Air War College, and he has a final question.
That's a very generous way to put it there, sir, but thank you very much. Yes, Andy Massison, Air Force's LeMay Center, located Maxwell Air Force Base, Alabama. And a question, or I should say a observation, as much of a question here. first, thanks very much for everything you guys are doing. But where's the Air Force and Navy here? I know, of course, being SDE, Army War College, going to be primarily Army, but I'm looking around and I'm wondering where some of my counterparts must have gone off to.
They didn't sign up for it.
Yeah, and so being that this is a joint all-domain issue that we're dealing with, I think that having, more, the rest of the services as well as the interagency as part of this problem may help offer, may help offer some insights and potentially get to a more comprehensive answer as we continue to frame this problem. That's I'd just like to ask if there was any other sister service involvement in your guys' work as you tried to crack this nut. Thank you.
Okay, real quick, this is an integrated research project at the Army War College. We look forward to opportunities for collaboration in the future with all of the senior service colleges and representatives from the LeMay Center specifically. But with that in mind, we were looking at strategic Landpower. We did invite all of the other senior service colleges to participate, and I see we do have some representatives from some of them, so I don't want to throw them under the bus and say they didn't get here, but some were here yesterday, and we've got a different crowd perhaps today than what would be completely representative. So, and General Zomer is a Marine too, so don't say anything bad about the Marine. Yes, and we also have some people this is a hybrid event. So some folks, it may be more practical for them to sit at their computer and be able to VTC in or off of Teams, and I'm sure that we've got quite a few folks that are doing that too. So I don't want to throw them under the bus and say they're not here, but no, they weren't at the War College in this IRP with this distinguished group of folks that volunteered to do this for strategic Landpower. So I think we're out of time at this point, but I want to commend these guys and gals for being so succinct in their responses, and also for the challenge of taking all of these tough problems on. We're looking forward to publishing from this, and I'll also tell you they've done a War Room podcast that'll be released in June, so you'll be hearing that. Look forward to seeing the announcements on that. You can listen to their comments at that point. We'll discuss it a little further. They've done video podcasts also, and they've also seen our media man across the room. So if you've got some questions, please reach out to them, but it's been a lot of fun working with every one of you. I appreciate your professionalism, and that goes for the guys and gals, guardsmen, soldiers in the back too. So thank you very much. Can we be back at 15:15, and a large round of applause for these folks.